Let's travel once more to the land of icy giants with anachronistic horned helmets. I'm going back to Sweden, as we've got 11 to work on. Last year I made a video about a number of these instruments made in Göteborg and their sister brand Goya, and went into the history a bit, so I won't belabor the point and do it over again. This one is from 1950. It's a Model 19. It's kind of Gibson LOO-ish in its appointments. It's one sexy looking guitar, actually. They had a knack for making really beautiful shapes there at the Levin factory. The top is some rather wide-grained spruce. The back and sides are birch, stained brown. The neck is also birch. It's a two-piece lamination. The fretboard appears to be European walnut, so they were using lots of local or semi-local woods for production. The headstock is a fun shape. Tuner buttons are kind of unusual. 3 on a plate tuners. The bridge, according to the owner, is likely a replacement, as Model 19s generally had a thin floating bridge and a tailpiece. It's really cool looking though. I want to keep it. It's got this subtle radius on the ends that feels right at home with the rest of the guitar. The action is bad, with extra light strings on it, and it's tuned down. We're looking at 11/64ths on the bass side, which is twice as tall as it should be. Also, this thing having no truss rod, you can expect a bit of a high relief in the neck as well, and that seems to be the case. There's a bit of a side crack in the lower bout. There's also a characteristic fingerboard crack here, running up to the sound hole. And the ends of several braces have come up or split. This is another case where they used brace stock cut perfectly flat sawn as opposed to quartered. I mean, there is some historical precedent for flat sawn braces. All the existing early lutes use them. Speculation is that the makers were buying pre-split spruce or fir soundboards, and they were likely a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters thick, so once you cut out the soundboard shape, there's usually extra width on the board on each side, so you slice that off, turn it upright, and you've got braces. It's economical, but it might not be the most stable solution, and if the back takes a hit, these are probably more likely to split. This is going to be another left-handed conversion, and of course it needs a neck reset. Looking at the end of the heel, we can see that it's pulled away from the body slightly. Taking the neck off one of these has some trepidation that goes along with it, because Levin used a couple of neck systems over the years. I'm pretty sure, given its age, that this one has a complex mortise and tenon that's similar to those used in violins, so the heel inserts into a mortise cut to exactly the same outline. Heating and loosening the fingerboard is just like usual. I put on the iron, the heat transfers via the frets, and then at some point I can get a knife under it. There's no problem. The trick is, I don't know how deep the tenon is. I'd like to imagine it's about the same or maybe shorter than the usual dovetail, which typically falls in line with the first fret past the end of the body. I'll lightly score the finish flush with the side, so that I'll have some kind of reference mark when I'm fooling around with the geometry of the neck. But I really don't know if there is a space that I should be aiming for at the end of the tenon, or if it's flush with its pocket, or possibly even glued to the end of the pocket like in a cello, for instance. So I drill some holes for my heat probes in the usual way, and hope for the best. Ordinarily, when I hit the pocket, I can feel it. There's a definite sensation. In this case, there wasn't, so it felt like I was drilling directly into the spruce wood of the block. In go my heat probes, which are actually foam cutters from Hot Wire Foam Factory, 6 inches in length. In this case, I'm relying on the conductive capabilities of the end block to soak up enough heat and transfer it into the glue line and make that weaker. This guitar has a spruce block, and spruce is much less dense than mahogany, so it can be more difficult to get the slow, even heat that I can in a Martin or similar guitars. I'm slowly increasing pressure with the heel screw, and you can see fresh wood is emerging. In this case, rather than simply pushing up, the neck is tipping out, which kind of makes sense. Since the end of the heel was loose, it's going to have a tendency to move more easily and first and in its own direction. And there is some danger I could even split it at the point where the rest of the heel is still glued in. So I'm going as slow as possible. So I heated up for about 14 minutes and it's not doing the normal things. I've told you guys this before, but mortise and tenons are much harder to take out than dovetails. There's no place to stick a knife here. They're too tight. And I got to push against a whole lot more surface area. So, yeah. So that's what the inside looks like. Sorry I didn't get the crackling sound. Let's have a look inside. First off, we have a simple ladder brace design. Fairly tall braces, no wide bridge pad, very simple. Looking toward the neck though, there's been some funny work. A massive slab of softwood has been glued between the upper sound hole brace and the neck block. I believe that's actually a hunk of 2x4 construction lumber. Why? I don't know. Maybe the end of the fingerboard was dipping, maybe this was to correct the crack that runs alongside the fingerboard. It's overkill, but it's also in an area that isn't very active in producing sound. Removing it would be a real challenge. It's going to stay. I'm going to try and glue down the central brace, which has a big split in it. I have to sand some of the old glue away, because the end of the crack was previously glued, not in alignment. Here's a syringe with heat shrink tubing on the needle that works well for getting glue down in the innards of the guitar. Use an old feeler gauge held in a hemostat and clamp it down. I did this in several sections, but wasn't having a good time. Well, the two halves of the brace, you can see, don't want to go back into alignment. There's a lip. They're overlapping each other. And the very end of it does not want to sit back down. It's warped away from the other section. And I think the only thing to do is really, we got to tear this out and put in a new brace, which is an operation I hate doing because it's so annoying. But it's kind of important, you know. We do need a central back brace. Removal involves heating up a palette knife and working it between the brace and the back. It came out pretty cleanly in one piece, which is useful when you're trying to derive measurements for the new one. There was a bunch of glue squeeze out along the sides of where the brace was sitting, which I decided to remove using some de-glue goo, which is an acetic acid gel solution. I just painted on, let it sit for a little while, and scrape off the softened glue. For the new brace, I decided to revert to a more normal quarter sawn orientation. This is an old chunk of spruce which I rescued from an antique piano bench of all things. It's well over 100 years old. So I'll get the dimensions right, and then I'll plane in a radius on the glue surface, which is about a 30-foot radius. It's similar to the other back braces. I'll remove some excess mass by lightly triangulating the brace in section and rounding over the top. Then I'll angle it towards the ends, similar to the original. Once more trying to sand the surface I'll be gluing to clean and flat. I'll try and get the brace to butt nicely between the lining by pairing the ends, testing it and then repeating. The brace is tall and thin and very prone to tipping, so I glued it in sections. Here I'm using the Stumax scissor jack on a plank between two braces to put pressure on the center. Once that's down in position, I can glue the rest of it. It's the same method. I can't stress how time-consuming this whole process can be. I'll glue a little cleat under the exposed section of the soundboard crack, not supported with 2x4. I posted a picture of this commenting the other night about how fun it is to take the necks off these, and I got some responses from Swedish repair dudes who say, haha, we do this all the time. Get used to it. And they say, basically consensus is they always end up putting in a bolt or a screw, because the way this neck joint functions, as a mortise and tenon, there's nothing really locking it in place, but this is a complex shape here. It's actually got a slight curve from the side of the heel, which is pretty advanced woodworking. I mean, it's very impressive to make this look like it's got a dovetail when it doesn't. In some ways, I think a dovetail would be much easier to produce in a factory setting, but this is the way it was. So in order to change the shape here, I'm going to have to remove extra material off the end of the heel, tipping it forward. But that might change the alignment of this side curve slightly. I don't know if you can see it here, but there is a very slight lip that is the thickness of the lacquer plus maybe a millimeter or half millimeter. A disparity between the tenon itself and the heel proper. So increasing some of the angle might shift this slightly in the pocket. And getting a perfect fit is going to be, well, really difficult. I'm still going to glue this in place like a traditional mortise and tenon, but I want the bolt in there as well for extra insurance because, you know, there's nothing to stop this neck from pulling up under string tension and pulling out of the pocket. I think with the bolt in there, it would be unlikely to come apart as much as it had. So here I'm drilling a hole through the neck block. I want to tie the ends of my new brace in with the lining, so I make up a small pillar, and I'll get that in position with the pointy stick. That's more secure. The crack in the side needs addressing. I'll put in the glue, pump it through with a suction cup, and then clamp it up using spool clamps. I'll remove the old and rather crispy saddle. I want to plug the slot, so I have to make it tidy and square, using a little chisel as a scraper. I'll saw out a piece of rosewood of an appropriate color, plane that to width. Should just slip in there nicely. I'll glue and clamp it. I'll plane off the excess. There's a big difference in height between the front side of the bridge and the ramp, so I'll try and blend it in a bit. Here I'm cleaning up the ends by sawing off the excess and filing a little bit. That's enough for now. I'll see what it looks like after I've slotted it. Here I'm inspecting the heel. There's a gap between the heel cap and the body, a little one, but it's there. I'll also see where the straight edge contacts the front of the bridge, and it's pretty far down towards the soundboard, almost touching it. I'll measure the depth of the pocket, or mortise in this case. Looking at the end of the tenon, we can see that it's not quite square with the center line of the heel. Experience has taught me that a guitar with this action and these numbers usually needs a little more than 1 millimeter removed from the heel end, so I'll scribe that and chisel it away. Then I can sort of look at the side profile and decide how much I want to cut in advance of trying it out. So I'm going to be conservative and slice off little bits, trying to push the tenon deeper into the pocket. It seems like the end of the tenon was butting straight up against the face of the mortise, so I should be able to control its depth by planing and chiseling and filing off the face, creating a bit of an angle. I drilled for the insert nut and glued that in. Then I continued cutting until the set was right. I glued the neck back in. Yes, there are a couple of missing pieces of lacquer. I will deal with those shortly. I'll replace the fret that I'd previously removed. I'll make a wedge to prop up the end of the fingerboard extension. Here I'm marking out a line for routing the saddle based on the intonation calculations from the StewMac fret calculator, being sure to remind myself that this is to be a left-handed guitar. It's got to slant in the right direction. I'm setting the depth on my router's cut with a couple of shims of known height. I want it about 5 millimeters deep. So I set the router on those and then lower the bit until it touches the top of the bridge, set it in place, remove the shims, and then go about adjusting the angle of the jig relative to the line on the bridge so that the router will cut in the correct place. With the slot routed in the correct place, I'll go back and sand and polish up the top surface a bit more, then apply a light coat of oil. This will shine things up a bit. I'll glue in the fingerboard extension wedge and get it clamped down. The fret ends on this guitar are protruding out way past the ends of the board, so I'll get after them with a file. I'll clean up the sharp tangs with a small triangular file as well. These appear to be a brass alloy fret, but they seem to be in reasonably good shape. There's decent height, and they're relatively level. The fretboard in this case is flat, and as are the fret tops. There are a couple near the body which are definitely high though. And there's one fret end which refuses to stay seated. I'll get some super glue under the offenders. So in the neck fitting process, there were two little areas on the side of the heel that popped right off when I pushed the neck into the pocket. Very annoying. So I'm going to fill those with a mix of glue and dust, and I'll be spraying a little touch-up color in this area too. As in most of these left-handed conversions, I have to put in some side dot markers on the sinister side. Mark them out, drill them, pop in the plastic rod, snip them off. The tops of the frets were a little bit rough, a little wide. There were some grooves that needed some spot leveling, and then some recrowning. And of course some polishing times 3. I'll cut the saddle to approximate height. I'll mix up some brown lacquer, mostly out of the sienna family. It's kind of a warm reddish brown. It's hard to do this sort of work without an airbrush. Just get into the corner there and some areas that have lost a bit of lacquer on the sides of the heel. I'll go back in with clear lacquer as well to seal it in. Sometimes in these lefty conversions I can save and reuse the nut, but in this case the spacing would be way too far off. So I'm manufacturing a new one. Cutting fret slots. Here I'm marking out the intonation points. Okay, things are buttoned up. I've still got a little bit of polishing and such here and there, some touch-up, but it's playable. This is another case of an older guitar with no truss rod in the neck. So the relief is about as high as I would want it. It's around 14 thousandths. That's kind of high, but it is what it is. And of course along with that comes a bit of a hump effect around the body joint. So in a perfect world there'd be a budget for a complete refret as well, in which I level the board on the neck jig and everything. You've seen me do that. A couple of years after this, in the mid-50s, Levin got smart and decided to put a truss rod in their guitars. And there's some interesting ephemera I found. The truss rod was very unique. They did away with the glued-in tenon and went with a bolt-on design, but the truss rod itself was part of it. It does this interesting dog leg thing inside the neck and emerges through the neck block into the interior of the guitar and then gets bolted in place, along with the second bolt that does what the one I put in the current guitar does, just holds things together. As I've mentioned before, if you do everything necessary to bring one of these old guys up to the modern, sparkling playing standard, you will end up paying more than the cost of a decent new import guitar. We're talking $700, $800, $900 Canadian, maybe American. There is a certain amount of romance attached to these old guys, but boy do they take a lot of work. I'm going to start raising my prices in the new year because inflation affects me too. So that might preclude some of these from hitting the bench just out of sheer economics. Can't be helped. But they are a fun challenge when they show up. They're excellent for people to learn repair work on because they're full of weird problems. Lots of fodder for thought, and diagnosing things. This one sounds great. The action is now 5/64 on the bass, 4 on the treble. And again, I'm going to play it upside down and backwards in Dadgad this time. So for all of us here at Woodford Instruments, Happy New Year, everyone.